give it to you, Sarah.
Okay, so I want to tell the same story that you told, but a little bit differently. Here's my version of the history of gentrification in New York City. World War II, they had the GI Bill. And the GI Bill enabled veterans to buy homes with very, very low interest rates. But and this was actually a way for the government to put money directly into the hands of developers who were developing the suburbs. So it was a government policy to funnel federal funds into the hands of developers. Because of racism and racial discrimination, these suburbs were not available to veterans of color. So this is what motivated what later became known as white flight, the movement of ethnic whites out of the city into these suburbs. And these suburbs were racially stratified. They were very conservative arenas: privatization, compulsory heterosexuality, car culture, consumerism, highly, highly stratified cultures in which those former urban citizens were now raising their children in an opposite environment from the environments they had grown up in. The city that was left behind, the city of white flight, was a city of low rents, of open neighborhoods. I know my parents paid $60 a month and got 3 months free rent for signing their lease. Okay, so it was that kind of environment, but don't forget that it also was the environment of urban rebellion. And in the 60s and 70s, now movements like Black Power and gay liberation were not created in the suburbs. They were created in the cities because they required that mix that is the life force of urbanity. It required people of difference living together to produce new ideas. And that's why cities were essential places for revolutionary ideas and for revolutionary art ideas. And ideas that in the 60s and 70s were extremely threatening to the dominant culture and had a lot of impact on social transformation. Now, in the mid-70s, New York City went broke. The explanation that we were given was that there were not enough rich people living here. We didn't have a tax base to sustain the payment for the city. And so the deliberate process of gentrification began. Gentrification is not a normal evolution. It was a deliberate process, and you must keep that in mind. And it was sold to the people of New York City with the claim that by attracting richer people, we would have a broader tax base and we'd be able to afford the infrastructure. I don't know if you looked at our infrastructure lately. New York City is overflowing with rich people, and we are closing hospitals. Our schools are shit. The subways don't work, right? None of this money has gone into the infrastructure because of the Reagan tax cuts. So we brought in all of these rich people, and none of the money is going back into the city. Now, what they did was they started to do condo and co-op conversion with the idea of attracting who? The children of white flight. And I think that this is really an important part of the cultural shift that accompanies gentrification. For me, gentrification is a supremacy ideology that is masquerading as reality. It does not see itself. Okay, it looks in the mirror and thinks it's a window. And it has a lot of the basic qualities of white supremacy, and it's very connected to white supremacy. So children of the white flight generation, they had a sentimental and emotional attachment to the city because their parents had grown up there. They would come here to visit their grandparents. They'd come into the city to walk around and smoke pot or whatever. They had a relationship to the city. But they had grown up in racial stratification. They had grown up in class stratification. They did not have a comfort with urbanity. And so when these people were attracted back into the city, they brought suburbanization with them, suburbanized values and suburban culture. And this was the first time in America that we had suburbanization. It was the first time that we had produced a generation that was a product of suburbanization. And with them, they brought certain values. They brought the value of the gated community. They brought the willingness to trade freedom for security. They brought a sense of obedience that was contrary to urban life. And so you start to see, as the city, through corporate welfare, which is what it was, okay, tax breaks to wealthy developers. As the city started to bring these people in, there started to be a flip in the perspective of how things were assessed. So, for example, a neighborhood that was now becoming dangerous to its inhabitants was called safer. right? Because it's not from the point of view of the inhabitants. When a neighborhood became homogeneous, it's called better, but actually it's worse. So what starts to happen in New York City, and the reason I've called this book The Gentrification of the Mind, is that the homogeneity undermines urbanity, and therefore the city becomes less and less a place that produces new ideas. And you know, what's really interesting is I realized last night, actually, that the word gentrification has a different meaning for more recent arrivals to New York and younger people than it does for me. For me, gentrification is a replacement process. It's an undermining of diverse businesses and mixed communities that are affordable, and a replacement with a bland and boring and banal, homogeneous suburban aesthetic that weirdly views itself as hip and cool when it's actually incredibly tedious. But that's not what gentrification means to people today. To them, it means they see all of that homogeneity as neutral and as the way things are. And when those places get replaced by Dunkin' Donuts and banks and McDonald's, that's what they're calling gentrification. But what's actually happening is that low-income people have no place to buy anything. So they're being forced into these fast food chains and these, the kind of things that, Dunkin' Donuts, these types of places, because the places that New Yorkers found affordable and expressed their culture in were already destroyed. So that's where I see that we're at now. I just want to talk a little bit about the gentrification of the arts, which is a big factor in all of this. I think that the proliferation of MFA programs and the professionalization of the arts has had very significant consequences on gentrification. Now that basically you're required to get an MFA if you want to have a professional career. If you want to teach in your field, you have to have an MFA. And it operates as a, it's like a gang system, right? So the other people who have your brand, whether your brand, whatever your school is, that's your gang and that's your brand. And those other people with that brand will help you, and that's how you advance. Now, this all produces homogeneity for a number of reasons. The first thing is a community does not have an entrance requirement, right? Anybody can be in a community. But if you have to apply and be accepted into a professionalization program, they're already filtering you. So they want a certain type of person. And you also have to be able to pay, right? And we know that these things are grossly, the idea that somebody pays $200,000 to get an MFA in poetry is really crazy. Okay. So now you've been filtered in. You're the kind of person that they want, and you have the money, or you're willing to go away into debt, and you have the time. So already, most people who would have become artists without those conditions are not going to go into that system. Then you come in, and you have common influences. You're reading the same books. You're listening to the same teachers, right? This is counterindicated to art making itself. Art making is about individual vision. And, before this professionalization was imposed, you became an artist by making art, looking at art, and talking about art, basically, with other artists. And each person had their own path through life, and you would eclectically acquire information or be exposed to things or read some book or whatever, and each person develops their own points of reference, and it becomes their vision. But when you systematize it and you make it mandatory, then you have very, very narrow range of work that gets created with shared vocabulary and values that are class-based and mostly racially based and repetitive. And this is just killing the arts in New York City. It is, sometimes I'm a novelist, and sometimes I'll sit on a panel or something, and I'm looking at, and you can tell what program people went to by how they write. It's so mass-produced. And And I want to say that I want to go back to Peter's question, which I think is really important about why here right now. Why now? And I think it's because the gentrification discourse is itself becoming gentrified. You know, one of the things about capital is that it's able to absorb everything. You know, and and I've had this experience, I'm old, I'm 54, and I've had this experience multiply, that you do cultural activism, you discover something, you develop it, you articulate it, and as soon as it becomes viable, they swoop in and take it from you. And even the gentrification discourse itself is being branded and marketed. So that's why, you know, here and now.
Marks, we'll start with Sarah.
Okay, I'm going to just talk about AIDS. AIDS is being gentrified. We're being told a false story about AIDS, where the most privileged people are being held up as the universal experience. So there's a lot of rhetoric about we've survived a plague or AIDS is over. That's right. There's 1.2 million people with HIV in the United States. Only 30% of them are undetectable. That means only 30% are getting the standard of care that exists, the medications that exist. In New York City, 1,600 people died of AIDS last year. Half of them were diagnosed in the emergency room. So what that is telling you is that it's a crisis of access to health care, which means it's a class and race crisis, and any rhetoric about AIDS being over is false. Okay, that's all I have to say.